The morning at Balmoral was supposed to proceed like any other carefully managed royal morning. Schedules honored, boundaries maintained, the invisible machinery of the institution operating with the precision that centuries of practice had produced. But in one silent instant, the document appeared where it should never have appeared, and everything the palace had been quietly managing collapsed into something that could no longer be managed quietly. Anne had seen the leak. She had seen what it had set in motion. And before the morning was an hour older, she had made a decision that would send a current of shock through Camilla's family and through every corridor of the palace that understood what her decision meant. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. A document leak inside the royal palace is not a simple administrative failure. To understand why Anne responded with the speed and completeness that she did, it is necessary to understand what a document of this kind represented inside an institution that ran, in its most essential functions, on the careful management of information. The palace was not simply a residence or a ceremonial venue. It was an intelligence environment, a space where what was known, who knew it, when they knew it, and through what channels the knowing had traveled were questions of institutional significance that shaped every major decision the family made and every major crisis the institution navigated. Documents that moved through channels they were not supposed to move through did not simply create administrative problems. They created power imbalances. They gave people information they had not been intended to have before the context that would have shaped their reception of that information had been established. And they created facts on the ground. Emotional responses, relational positions, expectations, and reactions that could not be undone simply by correcting the process failure that had produced them. The document in question concerned the Queen's private estate, not the crown properties that were managed through the official structures of royal governance and whose futures were determined by the constitutional arrangements that govern such things. The Queen's private estate, the property she had held personally, managed according to her own preferences, and protected from the institutional machinery that touched every other aspect of her life. It was the most personal of her possessions in the most complete sense of that word. And its future had been settled in her private wishes and in the formal documentation that those wishes had eventually produced, in a way that pointed clearly and unambiguously toward William. The document that had leaked was a preliminary version of the formal stewardship arrangement, not the final instrument. That was still being processed through the appropriate legal channels with the precision such instruments required. But preliminary documentation, in palace terms, was not preliminary in the way that drafts were preliminary in ordinary institutional settings. It contained enough of the substance of the final arrangement to make its meaning entirely clear to anyone who read it with the knowledge of the family's internal landscape. And it had reached Tom Parker Bowles before Charles had spoken to Camilla, before Anne had been informed of its circulation, before William had been told that the sequence of communication his father had planned was no longer the sequence that the morning was going to follow. Tom had read the document with the particular attention of someone who understood, from its first paragraphs, that what he was holding was significant. He was not unfamiliar with the language of institutional property arrangements. His own life had brought him into proximity with enough legal and financial documentation to give him the literacy required to understand what the preliminary instrument was saying and what it was not saying. What it was saying was clear. William was being designated as steward of the Queen's private estate. The designation carried with it the full scope of responsibilities that stewardship of a private royal property entailed: management, maintenance, the ongoing decision-making about how the property was held and used and protected into the future. What it was not saying was equally clear. It was not saying anything about Camilla's family. It was not describing any role, any involvement, any consideration of their interests in the property's future. It was, in its completeness around William and its silence around everyone else, a document that communicated a decision that had been made without the consultation Tom had believed, at some level he had never fully examined, would have been part of any decision of this kind. He called his sister Laura within 20 minutes of finishing the document. Laura received the call and the information it carried with the particular quality of shock that comes not from something entirely unexpected, but from something you had not allowed yourself to fully expect and are now confronting in the form of confirmation rather than possibility. They spoke for a long time. They moved through the stages that significant disappointing information produces in people who are intelligent enough to understand both what they feel and why what they feel may not be the full picture. The initial reaction, the processing of that reaction, the gradual emergence of the questions that a more considered engagement with the situation required. The central question, when it emerged, was not about the estate itself. Neither Tom nor Laura was the kind of person who reduced complex family situations to their material dimensions. The question was about what the decision communicated, about whether the expectations they had allowed to form across years of watching their mother integrate into the royal household had been reasonable, and about what it meant for those expectations that the document before them contradicted them so completely. Tom made one more call before the morning was over. He called a contact within the household whose position gave him access to the kinds of contextual information that official documents did not contain. The background, the reasoning, the relational history that shaped institutional decisions in ways that the decision's formal language never fully reflected. What he learned from that call was that the decision had been the Queen's, not Charles's. Not a committee of advisors. The Queen's, expressed clearly, maintained consistently across the private conversations that had preceded any formal documentation, and grounded in a set of reasoning that his contact described in terms that were simultaneously comprehensible and painful. Tom absorbed this. He sat with it in the way that people sat with information that was both clear and unwanted. Then he made a decision of his own. He was going to go to the estate. Anne learned of Tom's intention through the same intelligence channels that kept her informed of the movements and decisions of people whose actions had implications for the institution's stability. She did not learn of it from Charles. She did not learn of it from William. She learned of it from the network of trusted informants that decades of institutional service had built around her. People whose loyalty was to the crown's integrity rather than to any individual within the family, and who understood that Anne's early awareness of developing situations was one of the mechanisms through which those situations were most reliably managed. She sat with the information for the brief period that significant information required before action, and then she made her own decision. She would go to the estate first, not dramatically, not with any visible urgency that would have signaled to the people around her that a crisis was being managed. She arranged her departure from Balmoral with the quiet efficiency she brought to all logistics, informed her private secretary of her destination and estimated return, and left without the kind of announcement that her departure might otherwise have required. She arrived at the estate in the mid-morning, before Tom had departed London, which gave her the time she needed to do what she had come to do before the morning produced any additional complications. She spoke with the estate's senior staff, not as a visit, not in the warm, personally attentive way that she visited people and places that she valued for their own sake, as a responsibility. She told the estate manager, a man whose decades of service to the late Queen had given him an institutional loyalty that was among the most reliable in the household, that the estate was in a period of transition, that the formal stewardship arrangement was being finalized through the appropriate channels, and that during the period of finalization, access to the estate's private grounds and buildings was restricted to those whose presence had been formally authorized by the people managing the transition. The estate manager received this information with the composed professionalism of someone who had spent years operating inside the palace's most sensitive spaces. He asked one question, a practical one about the specific nature of the authorization requirement, the mechanics of how approvals would be granted and communicated. Anne answered the question with the precision it deserved. She said that authorization requests should be directed to her office, which would coordinate with William's office and with the King's private secretary to ensure that appropriate access was granted in appropriate cases through appropriate channels. Then she said one more thing. She said that the estate's private character, the quality that had made it what it was for the person who had held it, was to be preserved with complete fidelity during the transition period. No unauthorized surveys, no assessments conducted without formal approval, no access that had not been sanctioned through the channels she had just described. The estate manager said he understood completely. Anne thanked him. She walked the grounds briefly, in the particular way she walked through spaces that mattered, not as a tourist or a visitor, but as someone taking a real measure of what was there. She looked at the property with the eyes of someone who had known the person who had shaped it across decades of personal care, and who understood that the shaping was not incidental but essential, that every decision made about this ground, across the years of the Queen's private stewardship, had been an expression of something that deserved to be understood before it was managed. Then she drove to a position near the estate's main entrance and waited. Tom arrived in the early afternoon. He had driven from London with the particular focused energy of someone who had made a decision and was proceeding on it before the space for second thoughts could expand to fill the available time. His sister had advised him, during a second conversation that morning, to let the institutional processes run before attempting any direct engagement with the situation. He had heard the advice and had not followed it, which was not characteristically impulsive for Tom so much as it was characteristic of the specific way that deeply personal situations sometimes overrode the practical wisdom that people were otherwise capable of exercising. He turned into the approach road that led to the estate's main entrance and found Anne's car positioned in a way that was not quite a blockade, but that communicated clearly enough that the approach was not unobserved. He stopped. He got out. He walked toward Anne's car, and Anne got out to meet him. They had known each other across many years and in many contexts. The long, complicated familiarity of people who were connected by institutional proximity without sharing the kind of relationship that would have made the current situation anything other than what it was. Awkward, weighted, shaped by the collision of personal feeling and institutional responsibility that the morning had produced. Anne spoke first. She said she was glad he had come because it gave them the opportunity to speak directly rather than through the intermediaries and institutional channels that would otherwise have carried what needed to be said between them. Tom said he had come because he wanted to understand, not to challenge anything, not to contest a decision that he understood was not his to contest. He had come because the document had reached him without context, and context was what he was trying to find. Anne said she understood that. She said the absence of context was itself a problem the palace was addressing, and that the document should not have reached him in the way it had. She said the process failure that had produced the premature circulation was being investigated and would be corrected. But that correcting the process failure could not undo the fact that he now had information that had been intended to reach him through a different channel and at a different time. Tom said the channel and the timing were not what he needed to talk about. He said what he needed to talk about was the decision itself, not whether it was right or wrong. He had already moved through that stage of his processing and arrived somewhere more complicated than simple judgment. He needed to understand what the decision communicated about his family's position within a structure that his mother had become, over years of integration and public association, deeply part of. Anne looked at him for a moment. She had the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of the truth the person before her needed and could usefully receive in a single conversation. Then she said she would tell him what she could tell him, and that she would tell it directly because she believed he was capable of receiving directness and would be better served by it than by the kind of careful institutional framing that protected the institution's comfort at the expense of the individual's actual understanding. She said the decision had been the Queen's, made across a long period of private reflection, expressed clearly and consistently in the conversations that had preceded any formal documentation, and grounded in her understanding of what the estate was and what it required. It was not a decision made against Camilla's family. It was not a comparative judgment about the relative standing of different people within the family structure. It was a decision made for William, on its own grounds, for its own reasons. She said that the expectations Tom's family had developed about the estate's future had formed in a vacuum. Not a vacuum the palace had intentionally created, but one that had resulted from the absence of explicit communication about intentions that were still being formalized. She said the palace bore some responsibility for that vacuum because clearer communication at an earlier stage could have prevented the expectations from forming in their specific form. But she said the expectations, however understandably they had formed, did not constitute a claim. And the decision, however painfully it contradicted those expectations, was sound. It was what the Queen had wanted, and honoring what the Queen had wanted was not negotiable. Tom received all of this. He stood in the approach road to his mother's stepmother-in-law's most private property and absorbed the directness that Anne had offered him, which was more than he had expected and more useful than anything else he could have received. He asked one question. He asked whether his family would have any relationship with the estate going forward, or whether William's stewardship represented a complete separation of the property from any involvement by Camilla's side of the family. Anne said that was a question for William, that the stewardship was his, the decisions about access and involvement were his, and that the appropriate way to explore what relationship, if any, his family might have with the estate going forward was through a conversation with William rather than through the approach road to the property on a morning when the formal transition had not yet been completed. She said she would be happy to facilitate that conversation when the time was right. She said she meant that genuinely. Tom looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. He said he appreciated the directness. He said he would speak to his mother before doing anything further. He got back in his car and drove back the way he had come. Anne watched him go. Then she called William. William received Anne's account of the morning's events with the stillness he reserved for information that required full processing before response. He listened to everything. The document leak, Tom's arrival at the estate, the conversation Anne had conducted in the approach road, the question Tom had asked at its conclusion. When Anne finished, he asked her what she had told Tom about the possibility of his family's ongoing relationship with the estate. Anne said she had told him the decision was William's to make and had offered to facilitate a conversation when the time was right. William said that was correct. He said the time was not right today, but that it would come. He said he had no intention of using the stewardship as a mechanism for creating separations that served no purpose and caused unnecessary pain. The estate was his responsibility to hold. That responsibility had been given to him because the person who gave it had believed he would hold it with integrity. Holding it with integrity did not mean holding it against anyone. Anne said she had believed he would say something close to that. He asked why she had gone to the estate herself before Tom arrived. She said because the institution needed to demonstrate, in the period immediately following the document leak, that the transition was being managed with appropriate seriousness and appropriate protection of the property's integrity. That if Tom had arrived at the estate before anyone representing the formal stewardship process was present, the morning could have produced outcomes that would have been much more difficult to navigate than the conversation she had been able to have. She said she had not gone to block Tom in any hostile or permanent sense. She had gone to ensure that the transition's first day did not begin with an unmanaged situation that neither William nor Charles had been prepared for. William said he understood. He said he was grateful. Anne said there was no need for gratitude. She said it was what the situation required, and she had been the person available to provide it, which was, she said, usually how things worked. Catherine received the day's account from William that evening, in the private hours after the formal obligations of the day had been discharged, and the space existed for the kind of honest conversation that significant days required. She listened to everything: the document's premature circulation, Anne's response, Tom's arrival at the estate, and the conversation that had occurred in the approach road, Anne's call to William, and what had passed between them. She asked how William felt about all of it. Not the logistics, not the institutional dimensions, how he felt. He said he felt the weight of the responsibility more clearly than he had that morning, before the day had produced all that it had produced. He said the stewardship had been, at the start of the day, something he understood intellectually and was prepared to take on with appropriate seriousness. By the end of the day, after everything the document leak had set in motion and everything Anne had managed on behalf of the transition, it had become something he felt more completely. In the specific way that things become real when they have been tested before they have been formally assumed, Catherine said she thought that was how it was supposed to work. That responsibility that arrived without testing was responsibility that had not yet been fully understood. He asked her what she thought about Tom's question, the question about his family's ongoing relationship with the estate. She said she thought it was the right question to have asked, and that asking it in the way Tom had asked it. Not as a challenge, not as a claim, but as a genuine inquiry about the future. Said something decent about Tom that the morning situation would have made it easy to overlook. She said she thought William's instinct to not use the stewardship as a mechanism for unnecessary separation was correct. She said the estate was a place that had been held with a particular set of values by the person who had shaped it. Those values had not included the use of property as a means of communicating relational hierarchies or punishing people for expectations that had formed an honest misunderstanding. She said the estate deserved to be held the way it had been held. With care, with personal attention, with the understanding that what made a property valuable was not its material dimensions, but the quality of attention given to it by the people responsible for it. William said he thought that was exactly right. He said he wanted to speak with Tom when the time was appropriate, not through intermediaries, directly. In the way that Anne had spoken with him in the approach road that morning, honestly, without the institutional framing that protected comfort at the expense of clarity, Catherine said she thought that was right too. She said the situation had been painful for everyone it had touched, through no single person's deliberate intention, but through the accumulation of failures in communication and process that the palace was now working to address. The pain was real. The disappointment was real. And the appropriate response to real pain and real disappointment was not the management of appearances, but the honesty of direct engagement. William said he had learned that from watching the people around him who had handled difficult situations with integrity. He said Anne was at the top of that list. Catherine said she agreed. She said Anne had moved that morning with exactly the precision and exactly the judgment the situation had required. Present before the problem arrived, direct when directness was called for, and clear about the boundaries between what was hers to decide and what belonged to William. She said that was what institutional authority looked like when it was exercised correctly. not the expansion of personal power. The protection of the process that allowed decisions to be made and honored with integrity. Charles spoke with Camilla that evening, in the private sitting room where they had the conversations that required the most honesty. He had been informed, across the day, of everything that had occurred. The document circulation, Tom's response, Anne's intervention, the conversation in the approach road, William's call with Anne. He told Camilla everything, in the direct way that he had committed to telling her difficult things in the years of their marriage when the difficult things had been most consequential. He did not soften the edges of what had happened. He did not frame the day's events in ways designed to make them feel less significant than they were. Camilla received it all with the composure that had become, across years of inhabiting one of the world's most scrutinized positions, less a performance and more a genuine interior resource. She had learned to receive difficult things without allowing them to break through to the surface, not because she did not feel them, but because she had developed the capacity to hold feeling at one remove from expression. She asked about Tom. She asked how he had seemed to people who had spoken with him across the day. Charles said that Anne's account of the approach road conversation had described someone in genuine distress, but conducting himself with dignity. Someone who had come seeking understanding rather than confrontation, and who had received the directness that Anne had offered with more grace than the situation might have seemed to permit. Camilla said she was glad. She said Tom's dignity in difficult situations was something she had always valued in him, and that the morning had apparently tested it in a way that he had met. She asked Charles one question. She asked whether he believed the document leak had been accidental. Charles said the investigation was ongoing, that the channel through which the document had moved was being examined in detail, that conclusions about intent versus process failure would emerge from that examination rather than from assumptions made before it was complete. Camilla said she understood. She said she would wait for the investigation's conclusions before forming her own view. She said one more thing before the conversation moved toward its close. She said she wanted him to know that her family's disappointment was real, and that she was not going to minimize it or ask him to treat it as something other than what it was. But she said their disappointment was not something she was going to allow to become a complication in his management of the institution he was responsible for. Her family's feelings were her responsibility to help them navigate. The institution's processes were his. Charles looked at her across the small room with the particular expression of a man who had chosen well and continued to be reminded of the quality of his choice in moments that tested it. He said he was grateful for her. She said she knew. The investigation into the document's premature circulation concluded within 2 weeks. Its findings described a process failure rather than a deliberate leak, a breakdown in the compartmentalization protocols that governed sensitive documents in the period before their formal communication, produced by a combination of system error and human failure at a specific point in the document's routing. The findings were accepted by the relevant institutional authorities. The process failure was addressed through specific changes to the protocols governing sensitive document routing. And the investigation's conclusion, that the leak had been accidental rather than deliberate, provided a measure of clarity that reduced the more damaging interpretations the morning had generated. But the feelings the morning had produced did not dissolve with the investigation's conclusion. Tom and Laura had felt what they had felt, and the explanation of how they had come to feel it did not undo the feeling. Camilla had absorbed what she had absorbed, and the confirmation that the channel's failure had been accidental rather than intentional modified the story but did not change its outcome. What changed, across the weeks that followed, was the territory around the feelings, the conversations that occurred, between William and Tom, which Anne had facilitated as she had offered, between Charles and Camilla's children, which had needed to happen and had been delayed by the morning's events, between the various people whose relationships had been touched by the day and who needed to find their way through the disruption back to something stable, produced a gradual settling, not resolution, not the clean closure that painful situations rarely produced in real life, but the beginning of a new configuration that people could inhabit honestly. William met Tom at a location that was neither the estate nor any formally institutional setting. A private lunch arranged through Anne's office with the discretion the situation required. They spoke for 2 hours, in the direct way that both of them had been shaped by the women in their lives to value above the careful, managed alternative. William said the stewardship was his. He said that was not going to change, and he was not going to pretend it might. But he said the stewardship being his did not require the estate to be sealed against all involvement by the people connected to his family through his father's marriage. He said he would think carefully about what relationship with the estate made sense for Camilla's family, and that he would communicate that thinking directly rather than through the palace's institutional channels. Tom said he appreciated the directness. He said his family's expectations had formed in a genuine misunderstanding, and that he had spent enough time with the misunderstanding to understand it as such. He said he was not asking for what the document had shown was not available to ask for. He was asking for the dignity of acknowledgement, that his family's connection to the royal household was real, was valued, and would be treated as something that deserved consideration even when that consideration did not produce the outcomes the family had imagined. William said that was entirely fair. He said that was what he intended. The lunch ended with the particular quality of two people who had navigated a difficult conversation and arrived at something that was not friendship exactly, but was the foundation on which something functional and honest could be built. Anne received William's account of the lunch through a brief call that evening. She said it sounded like the right conversation conducted in the right way. William said he thought so too. He said he was beginning to understand that most difficult situations resolved not through the institutional processes that manage their surface, but through the direct, honest conversations that reach their interior. He said he had been learning that for years from the people around him who did it best. Anne said she hoped he was not referring to her because compliments made her uncomfortable. William said he was absolutely referring to her. Anne said she would pretend she had not heard that and they could both move on. He almost laughed. She almost let him hear it. And the estate, at the center of all of it, continued to exist in the quality of quiet it had always held. The particular quiet of a property shaped by decades of private attention from a person who had understood, better than most, the difference between what belonged to the institution and what belonged to the human life lived within it. It was William's now, to hold with the care it deserved. To protect with the integrity the person who had given it to him had demonstrated across a lifetime. He intended to be worthy of that, not perfectly, not without error, but with the honesty and the directness and the genuine respect for what had been entrusted to him that were the only qualities adequate to the weight of what he had been given. The Queen had believed he possessed those qualities. He intended to spend the rest of his life proving her right. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.